Is it trauma or is it the cultural tradition or practices that is masking your deeper emotional wounds? So today, let me talk about first what's the difference between just trauma and emotional wounds. I'll give you some examples on when a traditional Filipino cultural practice that started off as something beautiful can be something that can cause your emotional wound. How do you know that that's happening to you? And what may be helpful so that you can find healing in your own space? I'm Roanne Samuels. I'm a licensed psychotherapist here in California. I'm glad you made it. So, trauma, it's more of a clinical definition rather than it's a buzzword these days that everything can be traumatic. And if something is traumatic for you that does not meet the clinical definition, go at it because just know that there is more of that clinical definition, which is when something occurs that threatens your safety, your life, that really overwhelms your nervous system. That is more the clinical definition of trauma, like an emergency situation, a war, and something along those lines. An emotional wound, I see that more like an imprint. That is truly a case to case basis. So, something that may not cause an emotional wound for someone can to another person. So meanings mean everything here. So the interpretation. An example of an emotional wound, if you had like, let's say a babysitter that has been caring for you and that babysitter have had to leave when you were maybe 5 years old, that can leave an emotional wound for someone but may not be, depending on the resources, what protects the child from feeling that emotional wound. So there's a lot of variables, but that's the general difference between trauma and an emotional wound. Of course, trauma is an emotional wound. One important concept to understand that humans are constantly evolving, and as much as culture is, culture does not live in a vacuum. So even the stuff that we're talking about today, who knows, maybe in 2 years, 3 years, it's no longer applicable because the world continues to evolve, to change. It could stay the same for a while. And that is culture. Um, One thing that I was talking about function, every culture has to adapt, and it is rewarding behaviors that it deems to be something that is important for whether culture is family or a society. And so there's a function. Every behavior has a function. And when it becomes a dysfunction, is that if the behavior, the strategy you continue to use is no longer apt for the situation. So let me give an example. If you are like you were in wartime, and obviously, one maybe functional way that you could survive the war is to dissociate, to just kind of like not think about what's happening in the moment, just to put it like colloquially. So you dissociate. That might be a function so that you could continue to function while you are someone who's trying to live while there is a war happening around you. Now, if you're using the same strategy and there's no more war, and you have intimate relationships, but you are dissociating, you've continued to use that strategy may no longer helpful, it's no longer apt for the situation, and therefore it's a dysfunction. So just know that every dysfunction came from a place of function in which you or your ancestors were simply trying to survive. So let me give you a couple of Filipino cultural practice or norm that may started with a function but can also be dysfunctional depending on how it's used. So the concept of utang na loob, debt of reciprocity, really come from our indigenous and the ancestral practice of helping out each other, having mutual cooperation, and which starts with mutual trust. And that keeps the society going. That when I do something for you, not that you're keeping tabs, but that I trust that if I were or you were in that situation, I will do the same and vice versa. Now, utang loob could be dysfunctional when, let's say, parents start um, assigning their children to be responsible for them by giving them, so being in the guise of being generous, but almost creating a place where that is their emotional or potentially financial um, investment. So that is when the beautiful utang na loob is misused. Another one is the concept of hiya. I just made a video on how hiya or shame is actually a hidden Pinoy love language. Now, hiya is Filipinos are very collectivistic, as you know. And hiya is activated when, let's say, there's not a lot of food on the table and there's lots of people needing to eat. A parent might activate hiya by saying, no, 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 mahiya ka naman. Magtira ka sa iba. So, literally, when you say it in English, oh, be embarrassed, right? Or mahiya ka naman, have some shame. And don't take the whole thing, save some for others. So in that way, there's a function in a collectivistic culture to stay within the reference of you are also a part of the group, others are as important. Now that becomes dysfunctional when from the root word of pahiyain is to intentionally make somebody feel embarrassed, in which that is now a dysfunction coming from something that is useful, right? The example of making sure there's enough food for everybody. So, just giving you a couple of examples of how something functional and also out of love, you can say, can then turn into something dysfunctional. The key thing to remember is that when something is functional, usually comes from a place of generosity, of love, of being really giving. And then it becomes dysfunctional when you keep doing things using the same strategy, but now it's coming from a place of fear or scarcity that you might run out of things or comparing yourself to other people. Now, how do you know that this some of the cultural practices and again I want to highlight that just because one person has that experience, so it's really not based on the event, but your interpretation, how that event left you with. Okay, so that's the thing that's not useful in social media. It's focusing on the event, what happened, rather than your interpretation, what meaning it left you with. So when people see it, they'll say, oh, yeah, that's what happened to me. And it prompts a very similar reaction, when in fact, that would not have been the reaction had it not that people shared their personal reaction. So, how do you know this may be happening to you, that you have emotional wounds coming from family practices or tradition? Um, you might see patterns in your family kind of genogram, your family tree. If you trace that, you might see a pattern in behavior. Like, let's say, uncle was an alcoholic, dad was an alcoholic. Basically, family members, us kind of having very similar fate. Also, illnesses, especially chronic illnesses, that you may observe or you may be experiencing. Another one is that you become, let's say, the parent that you despise. So let's say I'm never going to be like my father, and then you start noticing, oh, you're talking like your father, you are scrutinizing your children like your father. The next one is that you feel bad when you express your truths, and it might be from the family system that is not something that's supported. There is a practice of keeping things hidden, loyalties, implicit rules that are hard to follow. Another thing that you might experience is that you may feel that you're in the wrong place. Like you feel like you just don't belong. You can't put yourself in a space that you feel like, oh, that's me. And you are confused as to, is that my story, or that's my mom's story, or your ancestors' story? And of course, there's many more, but these are just a few things that I often hear from my clients. And I will share with you that those things can be healed. It does take some investment. It doesn't have to be even 1 year, but investment in your energy and your time. So I would propose you see a therapist that is familiar with working with family or ancestral system, and that I want to give you hope that those types of ancestral wounds can be healed in the present. So in my practice, I do family constellation. And if you're curious what that is, you want to book a consult, the link is below. I hope you find this information helpful. Sa ulitin at ingat lagi.